All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Bruno Yoon. I am one of the Athenaeum Fellows this year. So in a developing country, let's say you have a high birth rate and you also have low infant mortality. So far, so good. But now you have yourself a lot of young people our age, and a lot of youths with their consumption of avocado toast and their failure to consume food at chain restaurants and wrong kind of youth. The kind of youth I was talking about aren't even young anymore. They're well into their late 30s at this point. Anyway, the kind of youth that this talk is actually about, we have Marc Sommers tonight here. He's going to talk about how we can see economic development considering the amount of influence that young people collectively have over society, particularly in developing countries. He's an internationally recognized youth and conflict expert. He has expertise on gender, peace building, governance, security, urbanization, inclusion, education, refugee and development issues. He's written 9 books and gotten 4 book awards. He's conducted research, assessments, and evaluations in 22 war-affected countries. 16 of them are in Africa. And he's a member of the UN's advisory group of experts for its progress study on youth, peace, and security. And he draws his expertise from extensive experiences in Central and East Africa, West Africa's Mano River region, South Sudan, and Kosovo. Now, cell phones are actually an important part of economic development, but now isn't the time to demonstrate that because the cell phone market is already mature in the US. You have iPhones coming out making very incremental changes, so please silence and put them away. Also, please don't record this talk, audio or visually, and this talk will be about 45 minutes or so. We'll have questions at the end for about 30. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Marc Sommers.
Am I muted? Oh, okay. I feel like I'm giving a TED talk, so I guess now I can walk around. Thanks very much. I have to say, this top table here, we could talk for hours. It was really, really a blast. And if this is what the Claremont students are all like, and I'm sure they are, it's really quite inspiring. Very open, very deep thinking, really taking lots of new ideas in. I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks to Priya and Dean Uven for inviting me here. It's my first time to your school, and I'm so impressed. I came a day early so I could explore and went up Mount Baldy, and as I was saying to Dean Uven, can I call him Peter? Is that okay? Because I've known him for a long time. I hiked until it started snowing, and then I thought it was a good time to come back. Before I start, I want to tell you about this picture. So I take a lot of photographs. This is in Burundi, and this woman comes up to me and says, "Take my picture." And I took the picture. I did what I was told, and I took the picture. But one of the reasons why I love this picture is there's no guile. She wants me to see who she is. And the other thing about the picture is there's always these young whippersnappers with nothing to do, and they're following you around, and so if they jump in every picture, there's nothing. So of course there they are, posing, but she just is. There's just looking straight through me, and that I thought that would be. There's another reason. I'll get back to this cover in a moment, but I wanted to just mention that. So. I'm going to start with a few questions. I figured we're at a school. Why not? So the first one is, when we say gender, what does that mean? What is gender? What in blazes is that idea? Anybody? Okay.
Well, we could define gender as a spectrum of femininity and masculinity that people identify with.
Okay, that's a very good answer. Did you hear masculinity as part of it? That's a big idea. Gender studies is usually studies about women, quite often, focused on adult women. We'll get back to that in a moment. What about youth? What's a youth? What is a youth? Anybody? Everybody's afraid. Okay, good.
I think in the developed world, we seem to define it as people under the age of 18 because 18-year-olds are often considered adults. But I think there's also like some other markers like that separate the transition from like young adulthood to adulthood, with that being maybe like certain types of independence, whether that's financial independence or moving to a new city or getting a job or pursuing like a advanced education.
Okay, that was one of the most sophisticated definitions I've heard in a very long time. Thank you very much. That transitional period. So I actually had to ask people for this book, for Outcast, I asked them, what do these two terms mean? Sort of on the ground, implicitly. When people say these words in development practice, international development, what do they really mean? Here's what they mean. This is what people said in these interviews. Gender means woman, and I would say that adult women, and sometimes girls. Sometimes. But usually adult women. Gender issues, adult women. Youth is usually male youth. Now, this is very interesting because, for a couple of reasons, what happened to female youth? They're not adult women, and they're certainly not male youth. So one of the things that happens is male youth get attention because people are afraid of them. And I would say, particularly if you're a male youth from Africa or the Middle East. God forbid if you're an Arab male youth with a beard, right? People are going to be afraid of you. And these are these stereotypes that seem to really drive people's ideas about youth. And one of the tragedies is that female youth are thought of as kind of not that important, right? They're not quite invisible, but they're ignorable, right? Male youth are important because we got a security issue. We'll get to that later. But also, gender has to do generally in terms of implicit ideas with adult women. So to get back to this cover, I very intentionally put a female youth on the cover. It says youth in there, up there, and I wanted people to know that for this book, female youth matter. And they're just as important as a male youth. And so this was a gender statement, in my view, to put her on the cover. And of course those guys are in there, but that's the one I'm talking about is her. Okay? So, two more questions. I have to, just to sort of get ourselves centered. What is a youth bulge? If you guys work in security, you probably already know what the concept is. No. Anybody? That's fascinating. So we don't cover, okay, give it a shot. What do you got to lose?
It refers to the flared base of a population pyramid.
Excuse me?
The flared base of a population pyramid.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Okay. I mean, you all get A's. I don't know. Great inflation. It started here at Claremont. So the youth bulge idea was created by a demographer working for the Defense Department, I believe, oh, bless you, or maybe CIA, I can't remember, but for the US government. And it came up in the 80s looking at this population pyramid, and it has to do with this bulge of youth, this irregular, this abnormal number of youth. Now, why do they call it a bulge, right? A bulge is something that, when you're fat, you have a bulge, right? It doesn't look good. And it's also, in this case, a bulge is something that's abnormal. It's unstable. It could burst. It could explode. So if you go back to this idea of male youth as being male youth, and you get to the youth bulge, what do you think we're talking about here? Dangerous young men. This is youth bulge is a security issue. Okay. So what's an informal economy? Where are the economist experts here? Oh boy, there's another one. I can answer the question, but I was just wondering if you guys...
The informal economy refers to like smaller individual transactions, I would say. So say Etsy, or I mean in the developed world it would be something like Etsy, or small home-based businesses.
Okay. That's good. I mean, I think the thing is that a formal economy, so economists like to talk about the private sector. What's the opposite of the private sector? The public sector, right? That's government. So all there is besides the private sector is, besides the public sector is the private sector. This just doesn't apply in, I would say, about 90% of the countries on this planet. Why is that? So when you use the private sector, it creates this idea that everything private sector is registered, companies pay taxes, and so forth. You got to be kidding me. Most countries, are you kidding me? Everybody's in the informal economy. As a matter of fact, informal housing in a city, everybody technically, what it means is it's technically illegal. You don't have a permit to do your job, to do your work at home or wherever it is. To roll out a blanket and sell tomatoes right on the sidewalk. You don't have a permit to do that. That's informal economy. Selling drugs, that's informal economy. Everything, pretty much everything is in the informal economy in most of these, not everything, but close. The idea here is the informal is not taxed, it's not registered, and it's where most people are. If you're a female youth or an adult woman in most of Africa, you will never, ever get into the formal economy. It's actually virtually impossible. They don't hire women. Okay, maybe somebody to, take out the garbage and things like that and clean and bring tea and things. They don't get in. So again, we get back to this issue of gender, which is phenomenally distorted and under-observed. How can you talk about youth without talking about gender? Is it even possible? Every young person is thinking, okay, if I'm a man, how do I get to be a man? What is a man? How am I going to do it? Or a woman, what's a woman? You have to think about that when you're a young person. It's all gender. So when you get to this issue of back to the economy, with the formal economy, who gets in and who gets out? Most people never get in. In formal economies in most of the world, you got to pay a lot of kickbacks to get that registration. How are you going to do that? You're going to bring in a foreigner, somebody you don't know, into your company, your formal company, who's going to find out all the kickbacks you have to pay? No, you get somebody that you know. Networks is how you get a job. There's actually very good research on this, not with a CV. And I actually think that's true in a lot of the world. It's networks how you get a job. Anyway, so the informal economy is where most youth are. And this youth bulge sort of orientates people to be afraid of male youth, and in my view, also to ignore female youth. Okay? So why did I write this book? So I have a little bit to... I wrote this book because I was so frustrated working in international development, because it's very obvious with reference to youth that it'll never work, the current approach. How could it possibly work? There's this obsession with programs, and maybe 1,000th of 1% of youth in a country are going to get into your program. So what's your point? And it's just been very frustrating for me to see how this approach is going on when I do research with ordinary people, and there's so much that needs to be done for almost everybody. So I guess one of the questions that comes out of this is, why do we aim so low? Why are we just doing these programs for small amounts of people? Pretty much. There's some about policy, but generally speaking, it's focused on these programs. The other issue that is that there is an overwhelming focus in international development, and not just that, but just I think just generally, but I'm speaking about international development, on quantitative data. So it fuels this idea that you can be technocratic and apolitical in changing people's lives. You run the numbers. Are they good numbers? Doesn't matter. If you got numbers, you run them. And despite evidence of success, and there is success, there's no question about that. You know, the rates of poverty are going down in the world, in some places. The current approach can lend the impression, with this sort of focus on running the numbers and big data, that you can do good development without knowing much about your target group, the nature of governments, or culture. As a matter of fact, the implicit message in this work is you can help poor people without having to engage with them. So that was my motivation, so to speak, some frustration there. So the book structure is pretty simple. The first one is an examination on the situation and priorities of youth. And I guess the focus is on what must youth do? What's their life like? But what do they have to do? I was talking earlier to some of you about this idea of values. Most people value education. Okay, good. All right, can you go to school? Now there's a different question. Quite often the priorities you have don't allow you to go to school. Or there's no room for you. So I found in my work that priorities of young people really matter. What compels them? What must they get done? And then I look at the priorities and the approach of international development. That's the second part of the book, to sort of look under the hood of today's development successes and explore what development looks like on the ground and where and how youth fit in the development enterprise. And finally, the book ends with a framework for reforming development policies and practices in today's youth-dominated world. And we'll end, I'll have a few aspects of that at the end. So the research for this book draws on extensive interview data that I've done over the years in 13 countries in Africa, including countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, and refugees from Somalia and many other countries. So it's a long list. I also read a lot of books, articles, reports on youth development and conflict issues in Africa, but more generally about the practice of development more broadly. And then I interviewed people. Interviewed people who were in the development world, donor and implementing partner officials, as well as evaluators and youth and what are known as development experts. This was important because so much of how development really works is not written down. So if you want to really know what's going on, you got to talk to people. So that's where I got the ideas, for example, of what really implicitly does gender mean, or what does youth really mean, because people don't write down. Well, for youth, we're really focused on just male youth. But one donor official told me, he said, if male youth aren't in a program, if we don't have all male youth in a program, it's not a youth program. That's a gender program. And his agency wouldn't fund it, as an example. Okay, let's get going. So, a couple more questions, I'm sorry. So the first one is, why are male youth seen as threats to their own societies? It kind of follows from what I've been talking about so far about male youth, and it's not as like people, they don't see themselves. I remember there was a big one of the big hip hop groups in Kigali when I was there in, 2008 or so. There was KGB, which sounded really scary, and then there was Bad Boys, plural, lots of Bad Boys. And then the third one was Goody Guy, only one. And then the biggest hip hopper from outside of Rwanda was a guy called Mr. Nice from Dar es Salaam, from Tanzania. So you see this, young people realize they're being judged and evaluated, and generally as a bad person. So some good guy was saying, no, I'm good, compared. So the research does reveal a broad fear of male youth. That's my take. That's my interpretation from looking at this. And here's an example. There's an intense focus on male youth as violent people. And here's one example. This is one scholar said recently that male youth, quote, are protagonists of virtually all violent political action as well as political extremism. Dangerous. Male youth are the problem. Is all of them, actually, is the implication. So here's another question. Why are most youth peaceful? The data does not back up that most youth are violent. In Sierra Leone, during the Civil War, even if you saw Blood Diamond, maybe 3% of male youth, got involved in the war. Maybe. Something like that, a very small proportion. I know it was less than 5%. So we don't know about why they resist engagement in violence, but most do. In Cali, Colombia, most youth won't join a gang. So what is it about this? What is it about this really inspiring issue that we're not, this resource with young people that we're just not diving in and engaging with? But that's the reality. It turns out that when wars do take place, a small proportion of youth get involved in the fighting. Most youth resist engagement in violence. That's the implication. We also tend to overlook the role of states as initiators of violence, not male youth. Now this is backed up by some very interesting research. And I'm going to put two correlations that I found in my research together. There's one correlation between countries with youth bulge populations, that's all of Africa, that's all of the Middle East, that goes into South Asia, that's East Timor. It's a huge number of countries on this planet, okay? So there's a correlation between countries with youth bulge populations and state repression. That is, when you have a super youth population, governments, afraid of male youth, I'm assuming, are proactively repressive because they're dangerous. And they're focusing on male youth here, is my sense. Here's the second correlation. When state repression goes up, so does the activities of violent extremist groups. So we have a real opportunity to engage with governments in a positive way. Why is that? Because their approach to youth is counterproductive. So if you engage positively with youth, as a politician, that's a win-win for you, baby, right? You can stay in power longer if you stop beating up these young guys in the city. So I actually am quite optimistic about this because in my experience, most governments, they have no strategy for how to deal with these super youth populations. They have no idea what to do with all these young people. What are they supposed to do? There aren't jobs. There's not education. What are they going to do? And they're not very popular with most youth. Why? Because they don't get anything. So there's a tension there. But what's upbeat about those two correlations to me is that there's something very positive to engage on and to really talk to governments about. So finally, most youth research to date is quantitative, and youth aren't often asked what they think or how the situation seems from their perspective. And I want to point out that this is precisely what Peter Uven found in the late 90s in his analysis of development, and it was crushing to me to realize, writing this book, this came out in 2015, that nothing had changed. That still was true, essentially, maybe a little bit better, but not by much. So the so-called protagonists that so many are afraid of, that would be youth, are often essentially voiceless. That's why I wrote this book. So, please keep this in mind, because it's a glorious mystery to me that we're not looking at, but that's really the essence of what goes on with young people, in my experience. Okay, so the central irony of this book is that youth are demographically dominant, the youth bulge, yet most see themselves as members of an outcast minority. They see themselves as not belonging. Country after country, in interview after interview, they feel like they don't belong. Even though, you go to a city, is there anybody here but youth? You look around, my goodness, there's an adult. Oh, I see an old man over there. There's a young old lady over there. But mostly walking is just young people everywhere. And so this is basically, what's so funny is they don't see themselves as having a voice or having power. They see themselves as outcasts. So the main huge challenge is not youth demographics, which is the focus of this. It's their alienation. That's our big challenge. It's youth who don't belong. Why do you think youth all over the world love hip-hop? Can I curse on this? How about Biggie? I grew up a fucking screw-up. Hello? Why do you think people love Biggie? All eyes on me. Putting thug life, right on your, Tupac, putting it right on your, tattooing it right on you. I'm a thug. Yeah, call me a thug. Go ahead. I'm a bad person. Go ahead. Right? He's a hero. Even today. Go to Palestine. He's a hero today. Alienation. People who understand it, people who sing about it, they're popular. And there's good reasons for that. Okay, so what we're working with here, our context, our starting point, wherever you go in these countries, or we're talking about Africa, we are working in a sea of exclusion, of youth exclusion. All these people feeling that they don't belong. And there's good evidence to show that they don't. So you have these enormous populations of young people. We've never seen this many. In recording history, there have never been this many young people. So that's a fact. So you have systemic exclusion. These are the two kinds of exclusion that I focus on in the book. So systemic exclusion is, I'll give you the example of secondary school. How can you go to secondary school when, 14% of all secondary school age people in the country are in secondary school? There aren't schools in the country for most people to go. Now, is that unfair? Well, most people want to go to secondary school. Forget about college. That's like 2% of university educated youth in Africa probably go. Maybe 3% in most countries. 5% would be really high. That might be, certain countries, but generally it's about 3%. So that's pretty much never going to happen to you. But secondary school, in most countries, it's not possible. There are really interesting exceptions to this. South Africa, Kenya's got quite high, but here's two others that have high percentages. DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's over 50%, I believe. It's run by largely the Catholic Church. It's not run by the government, most of it. Sierra Leone is another that's over 50%. So it's not all even, but I'll get to that in a moment, but the cultural exclusion gets back to that really sophisticated discussion of being a youth, which has to do with this transformation. I mean, youth, there's this focus, quantitative, counting, age numbers, okay, let's run the numbers, okay. Actually, being a youth has nothing to do with an age in most of the world, culturally. It has to do, a youth is that stage of life where you're leaving childhood and you go to the cusp of being an adult. Okay? The question with cultural exclusion is, what if you can't become an adult? How do you get to be an adult traditionally? Well, if you're from a farming culture in Africa, you got to build a house. The boy has to build a house. How can he get married? Where is he going to put his wife? Where is he going to raise his family? He needs a house. Okay, how are you going to do that? Do you have a job? No. You have education? No. How are you going to get a job? How are you going to get money to build a house? It's pretty hard to do. For a lot of youth that I've interviewed, and I would say, it gets to be difficult conversations, I will say, in interviews, there's no way, they know there is no chance that they could ever meet the traditional expectations in order to get a socially recognized marriage in a church, something, significant, in order to get married. And without marriage, a formal marriage, you can't be seen as a man and you can't be seen as a woman. So for female youth, how can you be seen as a woman traditionally if there's no one to marry? So these are pressures that are placed on young people in pastoralist cultures and farming cultures that really lock you in and give you this perspective that you don't have much in front of you. Because that's a failure is a life of humiliation. So in West Africa, they have a term for what do you call a 50-year-old who looks like a man, but he's not. He never got married. They call him, in some places, they call him a youth man, because they don't know what to call him. So it's called a youth man, and there's a beautiful song about being a youth man. So, to give you a sense of what exclusion looks like, it's not a mystery. This isn't like this theoretical idea. So this is from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which was really focused on access, not quality, but on getting people into primary school. And I would say, on balance, this was a great success. So this is Angola in 2010, but it could be this year. Primary school education, 85% of primary school age students, children, are in primary school. Secondary school, what happens? Down to 12%, 12.26. So where are most youth in Angola? See this big white space? That's where they are. They're not in the stats. Now this white space is where most youth are. Just to give you a little example of how it works, if you go to secondary school and you're from a farming culture, can you farm after that? You want to really humiliate and embarrass your parents, right? After they suffer and sacrifice for you to go pay school fees to go to secondary school, and you're going to come back and grab a djembe and be out there like this? I just don't think so. You're supposed to go and get a job at the government or the private sector, right? So there's another side to this. If everybody went to secondary school, who would farm? I'm not sure. So it's not completely clear, but from the perspective of youth, would they like to go to secondary school? From my experience, a lot of them would. A lot more than 12%. Okay. Oh. How many young people smoke a cigarette to look grown up? Anyway, he looks sort of grown up, I suppose. That's from Rwanda. Okay, so if you can't get much schooling and you're facing failed adulthood, there are outcomes to this. Class inequality, emasculation is, in my view, in terms of gender issues, has to be the most overlooked issue of them all, is emasculation. Right? You're a failed man. You loser. And men actually get humiliated in public. Female youth, failed women, actually don't get the humiliation so much in public because they're not usually there as much. So it's a different kind of experience. Unmarried motherhood. Do you really believe that a female youth, if she doesn't get married, is not going to have children? Most youth after a certain age in Africa are parents, as far as I can tell. So this issue of unmarried motherhood, I'll give you an example. In Burundi, that term doesn't exist. When I tried to interview people about it, we had to have like discussions. What do you call it? So it was actually not easy. This is not supposed to exist. Traditionally, you're supposed to take, she's supposed to be a virgin when she marries. That goes back, that's not happening so much now, but it used to, so I'm told. The idea of an unmarried mother was an impossible concept. So when this happens a lot of times, it really embarrasses the family. It's a great humiliation. It means that you have not brought your daughter up properly. So, and it also can mean that if you don't have Social Security in these places, where are you going to get money to live on? If you don't get a bride price for marrying off your daughter, what are the parents going to live on? Anything? Usually, they need that in order to keep going. So unmarried motherhood is so overlooked and so vast. And it's incredible. There's almost nothing written about this, which is just mind-boggling to me. That's where we are. So domestic violence, right? Emasculation. Unfortunately, all over the world, emasculated men, what do? They hit somebody. That's very common. And what does a woman, a mother, after she's been hit by her husband, what does she do? She hits her kids. So it creates this terrible result for families, for people. Drug and alcohol abuse, not so surprising, right? If you got no future, if you're facing these kinds of things, drugs and alcohol is quite common. Prostitution. One thing I've learned with urban youth, if you can't get married as a male youth, how are you going to have sex? Prostitution, if you make a little money, you can go and have sex and there's no expectation, right? You don't have to, you can just have sex and then move on and look for work the next day, something like that. Urban migration, if you're being humiliated in your village where you grew up, you leave. Why do you think Rwanda has one of the highest rates of urbanization in the world? Why would you stay if you can't be seen as an adult? You get out of there. And that's why they call it, they don't say I migrate or I'm looking for a future. The verb that's often used in interviews with Rwandan youth is to escape. I escaped my village. I escaped my home, my community, something like that. Okay. So what about war in this? In Swahili, there's a phrase that's used in many parts of the world, like in the broader region, which is this philosophy of life, which is called mambo ya kujificha, which means the affairs of hiding oneself. And hiding oneself after war is often important. So it's important especially if you were involved with a militia, you hide who you were, what you did, obviously your challenges, because you don't want people to know what happened to you, and the talents that you gained. Let me explain something about that. The talents during war. What did you gain? Okay, female youth. Learning from warlords. Can we learn from warlords? I think there's one thing we can learn. And that is, they exploit young people to a degree that is horrific. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff when I get interviews that I have nightmares from. And I kid you not, it's so disturbing. But one thing I realized is that they see that in some places they consider these as little adults, right? Is there anything a female youth can't do? Let's say an adolescent girl. She has like the widest diversity of talent and skills and abilities of anybody in a war zone. I mean, for example, she's the best spy. If you're with a militia, send one of your young girls across the border to look, because nobody will suspect her. She's just a girl. She doesn't know anything, right? So she comes in there and, you know, in interviewing them afterwards, they're very proud. They're risking their lives. They go across the border. They learn, or across to the other side in the war and learn all sorts of things and then come back and report it. Now that's hard, and that's risking your life. Okay, what else can they do? Obviously, sexual services, domestic, they can be fighters, they can be commanders, they can do all sorts of things. They have an enormous array of abilities. The tragedy is that it's people like Charles Taylor who figured this out. Because usually this is just a girl in, fetching water. Or a boy, like, boy, what are you doing here? Why don't you go out and earn some money for the house, right? So, but in some of these militias, the people who are exploiting them really see how much there is to exploit, so to speak, because there's so many, these young people are so talented and so brave, quite often. So, let me scoot along. So, two of the many challenges I found in the development response. This is from research, particularly with interviews about how things really work. One challenge is this idea of a stovepipe or a silo. This is a big complaint in interviews that, I only work in the education sector, so I only think about education. I only work in the health sector, so that's the silo I'm in. Or, for example, that's the stovepipe or the silo. Those are those ideas. So one of the what happens is that governments and agencies plan what they're going to do in advance. It's not, let's learn about what's going on and then decide. Quite often, there's priorities that come out from the, what are you going to do with the next 5-year strategy? You're going to focus on literacy. Okay, well, that will drive your education strategy no matter where you are. So you decide, not the people that you're going to be working with. So, what happens here is when you predetermine priorities without talking to your members of your target group, what happens? Here's an example. Where do youth go during and after war? Into cities. That's the safe place. Countryside is really unstable. And, of course, to the informal economic sector. Okay, whereas the development priorities, where are we going? The agricultural sector. Every African should farm, or almost all. There's a lot of arable land there. People should be farming, right? And also, we're going to develop the formal economic sector. It's the opposite of what youth are doing. So that's one of the challenges. That's a pretty big one. And then this other one, which I found remarkable in interviews. Didn't matter who I interviewed. The pressure, everything you're supposed to do is supposed to be successful. So this is from the website of the Canadian government's, their aid effectiveness agenda. Their agenda delivers results and demonstrates value for every dollar invested in international development. Every dollar? Really? With youth? What if he's drunk? What if he's on drugs? How are you going to, every dollar is going to be a success? Okay, so what do you do? To make sure everything's a success, here are two quotes. This is from an agency official and a donor official. It's basically the same. You get elites into your programs. Well-adjusted youth. Why is that? Because often you have to demonstrate success in the first quarter of your program. You're still setting it up. You have to demonstrate success. You can't take a chance with a poor person. You got to get well-adjusted youth in your program. That's the pressure of the system. Everything's successful. So an unintended result is that a good program can unintentionally, with elite youth in it, can unintentionally demonstrate, exacerbate inequality, demonstrate favoritism for the fortunate few, and it positions donors with those in power, which usually are not that popular. But it can unintentionally exacerbate inequality. And that comes from this pressure for success, which is really stunning to hear people talk about this. Okay, so Don't worry, I'm almost done. So, you're so smart, Marc Sommers. What are we going to do about this? So, I have it's my book. So, I wrote a framework, and it has lots of details, which I'm not going to go into right now, but I'm going to give you 4 ideas to think about. So, the first one is to start with research, right? Find out what's going on with your target group. That's my recommendation. Start with what's going on with them. And I'm talking about the overwhelming majority of youth are actually excluded in profound ways. So again, what must they do? What's their situation? But what must they do? What are they going to do no matter what you decide? Right? Go to a city, something like that. It's important to start with that, in my view. And then do some research. How are they getting excluded? And there are lots of practices that keep people on the outside. Not just youth, but we're focusing on that. And then which programs and policies have the best chance of reversing this exclusion? What can you do? You can't do everything. What are you going to focus on? What should be focused on? I have a sense that if you did this research, one of the things you must focus on is the behavior of the police, because they exploit everybody. In the informal sector, hey, everything's illegal. Okay, we need something. Or I'm going to take there was a woman in Rwanda, she was a female youth with children, and she was selling umbrellas. She had no other option. Once a week or so, the police would say, do you have your permit? All right, give me those, the umbrellas, or pay me something. Every week, she has kids. So, okay. I know that's a really scary young man. I'm exaggerating. So, use the research to advocate for policy change. And policy change is how you're going to reach a lot of people, not programs. So what's excluding them, and then how do you advocate for youth inclusion with specific policy reforms? Somebody that I've known for a long time said, forget about policy. It doesn't matter. Policy doesn't matter. All that matters is implemented policies, because there's a lot of policies that aren't implemented, and those are just, dressing the table. They're not really serious. It's the ones that are implemented. Which are the ones that should be reversed to support marginalized young people? So policy reform really matters. And I actually think this is the way that you can really reach a lot of young people. And I actually think in terms of advocacy that you can use the fear of male youth that most, in my experience, African governments have to reform government policies, because they're afraid of these young men. They're not that popular with youth. And so if there is a way to use that, the fear of male youth is what will get your attention with governments. And so use that, in my view, to start thinking about a more positive way of engaging with young people, because again, most of them are peaceful, no matter what. So there's a lot to work with. So for programs, I'm not saying that they're not important. I think if they're done in a way where you focus, what's your rationale for your program participants? This is something that I emphasize is called strategic targeting. Who are you going to target and why to get into your program? And will your program address their priorities? Is it going to be about you and what you think they should do, or is it going to be about what they must do? And my argument is focus on their priorities. And then this issue, you're dealing in the sea of exclusion, most people aren't going to get in your program. So how are you going to deal with that? How can you demonstrate inclusion in a place where most people feel excluded? This is really hard to do. I have some ideas, but this is really, really hard to do. But this is the context of a program, is this fact that most people can't get in, especially in a city. So I'm just going to point out, this is in Burundi. So I was about to take this picture, and this guy goes, this is the only one who can read. Or no, who went to secondary school. He says, wait. And he goes and gets his notebook, and then he sits down and he's writing, because he's literate. He's the only one. So he wanted me to know in my picture, right, that he's the educated one. So, okay. So if you can remember anything at all, it would be this last one. Find out who the bad youth are, the ones who are calling the bad boys, the bad girls. Address their priorities with policy advocacy and programs. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll have some time for questions now. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Hamza and I will come to you with the microphone. Please stand up when you ask your question, and do try to keep it reasonably brief, and priority will go to students.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is, you spent a lot of time talking about some ideas of what development should look like. Can you give an example of maybe a model program you've seen that has been successful?
Sure. So one in Burundi, where they worked with ex-combatants who actually come from the same village or urban neighborhood. And what they did was they got, I don't know how they decided, but they got some of them involved in solving conflicts between youth. And so they trained them with government officials to become, the informal dispute resolution council. Because there's always a lot of fights, especially when the guys drink, for example, or something like that. They also did something, they used grants. They trained people on how to, these ex-combatants on business skills. And then they would give a grant to a group, and it had to be people from the opposition, from different opposing sides, in the same group working together on a program. Now, this is a really ambitious program. But what they found was, in doing especially the training of all the people together, is they found that these male and female youth, mostly male, but also female, were really afraid of each other. They were afraid of walking down, to the market, for example, because people on the other side were there. And so one of the things that happened is they were able to sort of bridge those fears and realize, I think in most cases that they were pretty similar, had a lot in common, and sometimes these enterprises actually worked. I spent a lot of time in different places looking at the results of this program. It's one of the best post-war programs I've ever seen. I was skeptical that it could work that well, and I'm not sure how sustainable it was, but I was pretty impressed at how they broke down the fear, the starting point, the fear of each other from these combatants. So that was a really inspiring program, and because of that program, other people in these villages could relax, and neighborhoods, because the tension started to melt away. So that was a really powerful program.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could touch on the more female-specific barriers to education, like menstruation and child marriage, and any policies or programs you've seen that have helped get girls to school.
So one of the things that I've been saying for a long time has made no difference, and that's just life, is why do we have to connect education with a school? Why? Now, in Africa, you can't learn unless you're in a school. Okay. We're talking about girls and female youth. Until a girl hits puberty, she can walk to school, there's no problem. Fine, in a city, anywhere, she can walk to school. Nothing's going to happen. Life changes when she hits puberty. In many places, that becomes a time when if she's not an orphan, if she's with parents, it forces the parents to choose between protecting their daughter and having their daughter get educated, which to me is a cruel choice to have to make. Because the risk of the girl going to school because of sexual violence by the teacher, on the way to school, on the way back, transactional sex, all kinds of things happen. I just think why do we have to have them to go to school to learn? I mean, my God, everybody's got a phone. What about distance education? You know, nomadic cultures have been doing distance education for, I don't know, probably 2,000, 3,000 years. How come we can't do distance education for girls at risk? I don't get it. And why is that? So the idea of education is so old-fashioned in my view, and it doesn't take into account protection issues. So does it mean that all girls can't go to school? I don't know. Does it mean that they can't get educated? That's outrageous. So I just think that we have to, particularly in unstable areas, we have to think about education in a creative way. Otherwise, these young people just don't have a chance. And we have the technology, God knows, for distance education. Let's do it. So now that, to me, is a program worthy of, you could really scale up and reach a lot of people. There's a lot of boys who are also at risk for going to school in dangerous places because you can get abducted. Boys and girls can, but so sometimes, having education separate, formal education separate from being inside of a school, to me is absolutely necessary. So.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm hoping you can expand a little bit on the ideas you alluded to earlier about how to mitigate the risks to youth who cannot be included in this programming that you're discussing. It seems an inherent flaw of international aid programming to me that it cannot benefit everyone all at once, but changing the system seems a lofty goal. So how we can mitigate those risks without changing the entire construction. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, the way it's shaped quite often, programming, is how do we scale up? Scalability has become sort of an obsession, and there's a lot of talk about it, and it often doesn't work. Or there's not enough money because the unit cost is too high, so how do you get everybody into your training program, your job training program, because you're going to run out of money because job training costs money for the unit cost, right? Only so many people can go. So this creates the challenge of who gets in and who doesn't. Now, I'll give you an example from Sierra Leone, where there was a program for job training program, vocational education, where it was actually a very good one. And so there was lots of talk in the market. I was interviewing male youth and female youth. We were talking about if I could get in that program. So I went and talked to the people, the Sierra Leoneans who were running this program. Who gets in? Well, you see, the paramount chief, he has to say, he doesn't have money for his supporters, so he gets them in this program. A lot of the people in the program weren't even youth. They were adults. So because there were so many people, I mean, women, unmarried mothers in the market with children who were desperate to get any training for to advance in their life income-wise, to get a better job. They were talking about this program a lot. They never got in. It was the Friends of the Chief, and the thing is that the Sierra Leoneans who ran this program, they didn't see a problem with it. They were like, well, the paramount chief, he doesn't have money for his supporters, so he has to give them access to programs. To them, it was a total logic. So they also were elites, right? They didn't get that. So what I realized from that experience is the worst result from that program is if the graduates got a job. That just inflamed people. I mean, life is really unfair already. That's just worse. Friends of the Chief gets all the jobs too. from this wonderful program. So with that in mind, mitigating the risks, most people can't get in to these programs. What are you going to do strategically? I do think that research in advance can have you, identify different groups that you might be able to reach that won't create this such a level of upset. I mean, life's not fair, and not everyone can get in. That's the problem with programs. That's the challenge. My sense is that if you had a rationale that people understood, then I think at least some would. For example, people seen as pariahs, prostitutes. How about them? Can't they get in a program? No. Generally speaking, I mean, there are some, but generally no. People from a certain ethnic group who are the Twa in Burundi, for example, they're pariahs. You can't sit with them, you can't drink with them, can't eat with them, is an example. So I think if you look strategically and you have a rationale and you explain it, I think you have a better chance of not creating this situation where everybody feels like life is even more unfair, than before the program started. This is hard work. I'm not saying that there are easy answers to this. I mean, we're talking about a sea of exclusion. It's very hard to do, but I think we have to try.
Hi. So my understanding of this historical scenario is that in the 50s and 60s, the Cambodian king sent a number of royals and other wealthy Cambodians to the elite institutions of Europe and North America to become educated.
Educated.
Yeah, upon the contingency that they would return and help build a politically and intellectually elite class that would then in turn help to modernize the country. And my understanding is that before the imposition of the Khmer Rouge, and during which most of these elites were killed in the capital, that the capital was quite cosmopolitan and showed a lot of promise for development. And so my question is that, do you think that there are pragmatic difficulties with this approach to modernization and development that are the primary reasons why it's been unsuccessful so far or not implemented? And if you think that those pragmatic difficulties are the primary reason it's failed, or hasn't been tried, what do you think some are? And then if that's not your greatest objection, if you think that this approach is fundamentally flawed in some way, what is that flaw?
Okay, big question. I guess I would sum it up with two words. That concern that people have is what's called the brain drain. When people go away and get education, in Claremont, California, would you go back? I mean, it's so funny, right? It depends on the culture. If it's Rwanda, if you get your education, you have to go back and help develop the country. And they really believe that. What about Sierra Leone? Let's say you go to Claremont College and you go back and now you're going to develop the country. Your parents are going to say, what are you doing here? You idiot. You're supposed to be in America sending us money by Western Union. You dummy. It's a totally different culture. So, in that model, the purpose in Sierra Leone, and not just Sierra Leone, my God, I think most countries are like Sierra Leone, where the idea is you send remittances. And that is a model of development. It's not what the Cambodian king had in mind. And in terms of macroeconomic terms, that would be seen as brain drain, right? The capacity is going away. But in terms of stabilizing families, and I'm talking extended families, school fees, blah, 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 for cousins, nieces, whatever. Somebody has to go to America or the UK or somewhere and send back remittances. My God, Kosovo, is anybody left? I mean, as soon as you get a certain age with certain education, you're supposed to be in Austria or Germany or somewhere sending back remittances. And so that remittance economy, I think quite often is also a model of economic development, but it's not what the Cambodian king had in mind. So in a context like Rwanda, which in my experience is not many countries are like that, that can work because people actually go back. But a lot of countries won't do that because they're not thinking about the state. They're thinking about their family. And they're thinking of how do we stabilize things? How do we get a base of capital so, children, nieces, nephews can move ahead? And I just want to say one last thing is the people who are in this remittance kind of environment and they come to this country or they go to the UK or they go to Belgium or wherever it is, Australia, so on and so on, the pressure on them can be immense. To send, what are they supposed to live on at some point? They have to send everything home. The desperation of their families often is so great, and they're really expected to really send home. This is one of the reasons why when people go to America, it's like, okay, you came to America, you go to America, you're a millionaire. So when you go back to your country, you better have a lot of gifts. Well, if you are driving a taxi or Uber, how are you going to do that? You got to save and save and save and save for years to bring back all the gifts for all your relatives. And, and I think in a lot of places, no matter how much you bring back, it's not going to be enough because you're a millionaire. Oh, where's all that money? So you don't bring it here. That kind of thing. So there's a lot of tension in these economic models. And again, research can tell you what's actually going on the ground.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering where the funding primarily comes from for these programs across these countries, whether it comes from the domestic governments or NGOs or international actors, and whether across those different types of funding, the objectives of the program, different programming might be different. I'm assuming that it obviously varies across countries and everything, but just kind of your insight into that dynamic.
Okay. I would say in Africa, most of the funding for programs comes from non-government sources, from what they call bilateral agencies like U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, or the equivalents, DFID in the UK, and the EU, and NORAD from Norway, and SIDA from Sweden, SIDA from Canada, and on and on. So there are those kind of traditional forms. Governments normally in Africa don't fund much. There are important exceptions. Ghana has funded some important programs, I understand. South Africa can be quite engaged, the government, in programming for youth and others, economic development. But what we think of as a program generally has a kind of generally support from the outside, and the private sector is increasingly, or the formal sector, is increasingly getting involved in the mix. The Gates Foundation, for example, funds huge programs that cover lots and lots of countries. So I would say, generally speaking, that's true. I mean, Colombia in South America, the government is really active in programming in a lot of ways. So there are exceptions to this rule, but what our concept of a program generally comes from outside.
This goes back to the kind of distance education. While I think that we also need a creative approach to education, is there a worry that distance education could isolate females from society even further?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to think that through. I mean, I totally agree. Why should a girl have to sit at home, or a female youth have to sit at home just to get education? Maybe usually she wants to be in school with her friends, right? There are other ways to do this. Communities can escort children to school and then pick them up and come back. That's another option. There are different, and that actually has been tried. So that might be a way through. The problem is that transactional sex often can happen with teachers at schools, and that is actually very scary. And I mean, it seems to be very common. And that one is so pernicious that I think, I think the distance education is not the best answer, because I think children being in school is a socializing. There's that socializing dimension of education that's very important. It's not just what's in your book that you're learning. But it's just really dangerous, and that's one of the reasons why girls leave. I want to point one thing out, though. One thing I've learned about education is, people look at the ratios, like, are girls in? Oh, it's going down. Oh, look, in secondary school, the ratios are going in. Do you know what I've learned? Sometimes the ratios of girls in school is going up because boys are leaving school. This is a phenomenon all over the world. I bet most students here are female. Is that right? Okay, 51%. Well, thank you very much. That's very unusual from what I can tell. I was going to visiting schools with my son, when he was a junior in high school. I remember thinking, I was going to these tours. I was watching your tours today. I was looking at tours and I thought, my God, I had no idea. My child is a minority. Because it's just like, it would be like, 8 girls go with him and 2 boys, like really in the back, in the tours, one after the next, and at Fletcher, I don't know what the percentage was. It was over 60%, I believe, and that's very common. Where are the boys? How come they're not going to school? Do you think that's only at universities in America? No. Boys are leaving school. Apparently, in Latin America, this is a really big deal. Why aren't boys going to school? That is a gender issue. Why are they leaving? And so one of the reasons why it looks like we're doing better with girls' education has nothing to do with girls. It has to do just with proportions. Boys are leaving. And that, to me, is quite alarming as well. So we have to look at both sides, not just girls' education. We have to look at boys' education, too, increasingly, because they're leaving in a lot of places.
So that was the final question for the night. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
Yes. I want you to leave with this. I actually am very optimistic about the future, and I'm serious about this because I in my conversations with people from African governments, they don't know what to do about these youth issues, and you wouldn't either. There's so many youth in these countries. It's unprecedented. And what that means is that there are lots of people that are open to talk, to discussion, to looking at for solutions. And so that makes me very optimistic that we can find a way forward that really can improve the lives of more and more youth in Africa and elsewhere. So that's it.
Thank you.
Please
Please join me in thanking Marc Sommers.